Hello, my name is Kevin with Preventicx, and in this step 1 video I'm going to show you how to access sample data from the IMeasureU home page. We're putting together a 4-step video on how to create a dashboard with sample data from IMeasureU using Excel. This is the first step of getting access to that data. So here we are on the home page for IMeasureU. We're going to follow the login button. And I currently don't have an email and password. This is a publicly facing website, so here if we look down at the bottom of the page, IMeasureU gives us a link to explore some sample data. So we're going to follow that link. We're going to give them our email address. And we're going to explore some sample data. We're going to be redirected to the sample data repository and the dashboard for the sample athletes. So on this web page, we have access to 2 different kinds of athletes. We're going to stick with the runner. If we look up at the top here, just to the right, we get a calendar of events. Right, this is all the events stored for this runner. We're going to download a handful of these events to show you how we can get this data into Excel. But here we're just going to pick. Here in this example, we're just going to pick a single day. By clicking on a single day, this IMeasureU site then loads their dashboard of the data that's in this specific day. We need to export this in order to get this into Excel. So up here at the top right, you see a download button. We're going to export this session summary. And in this example, you're going to have the option of downloading 2 different or both CSV files. So in this example, we're going to be using the entire summary. This gives you all of the raw data. We're not going to be using the runner bins CSV. So we want to make sure as we're downloading this, we're choosing the summary. We're going to save file, and we're going to save it to a sample data folder. All right, so step 1 is done. I've shown you how to access the sample repository and to export a daily session. So I'm going to fast forward. It is in the background. I'm going to download a couple weeks worth of data, and we'll see you in step 2. Hi, and welcome back to step 2 of this instructional video on how to create a dashboard in Excel using sample data from IMeasureU. I'm Kevin with Preventicx, and in this short teaser video, I'm going to show you how to load the data into Excel. So in step 1, I showed you how to access the data from IMeasureU and export it to Excel. In this step, I'm going to show you how to load all of that data into Excel for analysis. So in the background, I went through this runner and I downloaded about 2 weeks worth of data. Okay, so they are individual downloads. I fast forwarded in the background. So we have our data in a folder stored on our computer, and we're going to now bring that data into Excel. So we're going to fire up Excel here, and in Excel version 2016 and newer, you have a feature inside of the data tab that allows you to get data. Okay, we're going to expand this folder, and since our data is in a file, we're going to hover over the file, and in this example, Excel gives you a lot of different sources to choose from. So in this case, all of our data is in a single folder. We're going to select that option. Excel asks us where is that data located. Our data is stored in a single folder. Go get all the contents of that folder. Here, Excel returns back a summary of what's in that folder just to make sure we're in the right place. Here are all of our consecutive CSV files from the 12th to the 28th. And now we're going to tell Excel, hey, we want to combine all this data and bring it into one spreadsheet. So here down in this link, we're going to select Combine and Load. Excel is going to perform that query on our data. And then we're going to get a summary from Excel. So this is basically saying Excel is telling us, hey, this is what I found when I combined all these files. I have this example to show you with all the column headers that I found. This is all of the data that's in one of those CSV files. We're going to go ahead and say OK, click OK, and load that data into Excel. So what Excel is going to do is it's going to run that query against all those files. It's going to combine them into one spreadsheet, and it's going to name that spreadsheet with our folder name. So here we have our source data, right? If we look on the date filter, it shows all of our days, March 12th to March 28th. Okay, so that is the second step. Now on to the third step. We're going to want to create a few pivot tables. If you're not familiar with pivot tables, I encourage you to do some research online. Pivot tables is a very efficient and user-friendly way that Excel provides the user that so we can aggregate our data. Okay, so in order to insert a pivot table, we're going to create a few of these. So we're going to create one pivot table to compare a couple different metrics to. Okay, so we're going to select. In order to insert a pivot table, you have to come up to the Excel ribbon here and select Insert, and then you have this link for Pivot Table on the far left. We're going to select Insert Pivot Table. You get a small little dialog box here. Excel is asking you, hey, where is your data? It populates that first tab in our spreadsheet. Where do you want to create this new pivot table? We're going to select a new worksheet, and it's very important that we add this pivot table to our data model. So kind of behind the scenes here, Excel is building a data model with our source data. So we want to make sure we add this pivot table to our data model, and we're going to select OK. Excel is going to create a new page, and this is what the interface of the pivot table looks like. You get this chart area over here on the left, and if you look over here on the right, you have all of your variables from your data. So that was step 2. We showed you how to load data into Excel from a folder and have Excel combine all that data into one source data tab. And stick around for step 3, where we'll show you how to create some pivot tables. Hi, and welcome back to step 3 of our informative video on creating a dashboard using sample data from IMU. I'm Kevin with Preventicx, and in this step we're going to show you how to create some pivot tables and look more at a graphical representation of our data. So if you recall, in step 2 we told Excel, hey, load all of our sample files into one source spreadsheet. We have that here, and now we are going to show you how to create some pivot tables. So if you've never seen a pivot table before, I encourage you to do some research online about what they are. They're really efficient and user-friendly way to kind of aggregate your data and visualize your data. So in this first example, we're gonna, if you see here, we have the chart area over here for the pivot table, and on the right we have our data broken down. In this top section, it shows all of our column headers or our dimensions in our data, and then we have this 4 square grid down here. We can orient our data in filters, columns, rows, and values. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is we want to filter out. If you noticed in how our data was oriented, these files for each day, it includes all of the drills. So the feature in the IMU sensor allows you to label your sessions. So we're going to focus. So in this export, it exports all of those sessions individually, and then you have one entry that's basically the aggregate for that day. So if I filter down to one day, for example, it's going to have all the sessions for that day, and then it's going to have one record where it's the aggregate of all those sessions. So in this, for the visual analysis, we want to make sure that we're only looking at all of the all rows. Okay, so we're aggregating on the all rows. So if we go back to here to our pivot table, we are going to, for the session range, we're going to drag that to filter. Okay, so this allows us to go ahead and select just that all value. So that's the aggregate of all of the days. So we're going to start with our filter there. Next, we're going to arrange our data via the step date or the date. So we drag our step date down 2 rows, and that's where it groups all of our data by day. In this first pivot table, we're going to be interested in looking at the impact load, the side-to-side difference in impact load. So we scroll down to our section of our variables on impact load. We're going to drag impact load left down to values, and then we're going to drag impact load right down to values. So by doing that, here we can see our data is oriented now by day, and we can see the individual daily comparison of impact loads left versus right for each of the days in our data set. This is obviously oriented by numbers, so we're going to try to create a graphical representation of this data. So in Excel, that's through the use of pivot charts. We can highlight all of our data here. We're going to come up to the pivot table analyze section here, and we're going to select a pivot chart. For this simple example, we're going to use line chart here. We're using days over time, so line is a really kind of efficient, user-friendly way to represent data in this case. So here we go. We had Excel produce a line chart of our data. Our legend shows us the series that it's comparing to. We can do some customization. We can, to give us some more screen real estate, let's move our legend to the top. We can put a title to this chart. We can say right versus left impact load. Is our title of our chart. So there we go. We have filtered down on our all, and we can see that there was a spike in impact load right around from the 14th to the 16th. We can see there was some divergence in side to side from left versus right impact load. This is but then it starts to taper off. So that's our first. That's our first table. We're going to create a few more pivot tables here. So we're going to go back to our sample data. We're going to go ahead and insert. We're going to insert another pivot table. So again, in step 2, I kind of walked you through this process. You make sure you have your source data highlighted. We're going to send this to a new worksheet. Probably the most important step is we want to add this pivot table to our data model. This is going to free up some more features in the pivot charting area when you do this. So make sure that you're adding this pivot table to your data model. Select OK. Again, we have our second pivot table. So real quick, we're just going to go back to our first pivot table that we created. We're going to right click on the sheet name and we're going to rename it. We're going to call this total impact load right versus left. Okay, so that's our impact load pivot table. Come back over to the new pivot table that we just created. Again, we see the same kind of interface with the same workflows. So again, we want to first start by filtering our session range down to the all, just to the aggregate. Just want to make sure we select multiple items here. Deselect all. Come down here to select this all. Okay, so now our data is filtered down to the correct type of data. Again, we're going to drag that step date down to rows to group our data by day. And in this example, we're going to look at bone stimulus. Same side-to-side difference, but using the bone stimulus metric. So here we come down to our bone stimulus variables. We're going to drag bone stimulus left down to values and bone stimulus right down to values. Okay, so again, Excel kind of aggregates that data across days. It shows you our grand total on left and right across all of the days. But again, we want to kind of form a graphical representation, so we're going to highlight our data, come up to pivot table analyze, and insert pivot chart. So in this example, let's do another line chart. Okay, so we're going to select OK here. We come up, make this a little bit bigger. Again, we can provide some more screen real estate here. Let's move the legend to the top. Let's provide a chart title, and let's call this. Let's call this bone stimulus right versus left. Okay, so we can see here that now bone stimulus looks like a different pattern than when we looked at impact load. So we can still see that divergence around March 15th, but tends to dip a little bit and then to even out towards the last week of the session. So that's a graphical representation of bone stimulus compared side-to-side differences over the 2 weeks. So we have our second one done. We're going to come down here and we're going to rename this as bone stimulus right versus left, and then we're going to create 2 more. Okay, so we're going to follow those same steps. Right click, come back to our source data, to the insert tab, select pivot table, make sure our data is highlighted. We're going to put this in a new worksheet. We're going to add this to our data model. Okay, so we're going to create a third. We're going to create a third pivot table here in this example. Again, we want to make sure we're filtering down to the correct level of granularity. So we're going to select multiple items here, deselect all, come down here and select the all. So now our data is filtered down correctly. We're going to grab step date again, drag it down to rows. This time we're going to look at the comparison, the side-to-side comparison of total steps. So we're going to come down here to total steps. If you see, there's a lot of data in these sample files, but so those medium intensity, high intensity. Let's come down to the different levels of G's and see if we can find total. Oh, there it is. Okay, total steps left and right. So we're going to highlight that, drag it down to values. Highlight total steps right, drag it down to values. Okay, so now we have our total steps represented in a grid format, or just your normal contingency table format, frequency table. We're going to go ahead and look to represent this graphically. So again, we highlight our data, select pivot chart. In this case, we're going to do a column chart on this one. No, we're going to do a bar chart. We're going to represent this in a bar. So we're going to go ahead and do that. Bring this out. Give us a little more screen real estate here. Let's move the legend to the top again. Give us some more screen real estate for our data. Now you can include these or not. You know, you can maximize screen real estate here. This is just an example, so we're going to do that. Let's just add a chart title. We're going to call this total steps right versus left. Okay, there's our chart title. Here's our column chart oriented horizontally, so we can see the days kind of easily. We see a little bit of a spike here in total steps. Not too much deviation left, side-to-side difference. Maybe March 22nd was the biggest day that there was a side-to-side difference in total steps. Maybe a little bit down here, March 16th. So that's our pivot chart for total steps left versus right. We're going to create one more. Come down here first. We're going to come down here, rename this. We're going to call this total steps right versus left. And we're going to create one more pivot table. We're going to go back to our data. We're going to select insert pivot table here. Again, we've seen this a few times already. Make sure you add it to your data model. And then we're presented with our fourth and final pivot table that we're going to create. And this one, we're going to look at two different kinds of variables. So in this example, we still have to filter our data down to the level of granularity that we require. So select multiple values, deselect all. Then we're going to select this all. Okay, then we're going to drag our step date. We're still going to group by the same kind of variables, so we're going to look at this over the 2 weeks. And then here we're going to look at impact load versus total steps. So we're going to grab total impact load, right? We're going to drag this down to values, and then we're also going to drag total steps. So we come down here. We had our total steps side-to-side difference here. We're going to grab total steps. We're going to drag that down. So now this is a numerical comparison between the total impact load on each day compared to the total steps. Okay, so one of the variables that could influence this is the intensity of your steps. But one thing you notice right off the bat is that these numbers are on two completely different scales, right? One's measured in the tens of thousands, and then one's measured in the single thousands. So we have to take that into consideration when we're graphically representing these two variables. So again, we're going to select our data. We're going to go up into pivot chart, and we're going to go back to that line chart example here to kind of reference this nuanced representation. Again, so here we have our line chart. We can dress it up a little bit. Let's move the legend to the top, get some screen real estate. So here you see that this blue line is our sum of impact total, right? But our sum of total steps is almost flat, right? Because we're using a line chart with a single axis. So we want to make sure that we're, in this case, in order to adjust for that, we have to create a secondary axis on this on this line chart to accurately represent our sum of total steps. All right, so we're going to go ahead and Excel has a really nice way of doing this. So we're going to come down here to our series, to our time series of total steps, and we're going to click on that orange line. Right. So now we're going to do a right click on once it highlights our data series, and then we're going to come down here to format data series, and we're going to select over here. Excel gives us the option to add a secondary axis. Okay, so once we do that, now both of these series are on similar axes. So now we can see how they kind of correlate to each other a little better than looking at almost a flat line. Right, so here we see that same kind of divergence as in our other charts. We see a little bit more divergence here as this relationship starts to decrease and then kind of flatten out. So that was a way. So we've chosen 4 different areas of the sample data to kind of graphically analyze. We'll change our last pivot table to total steps versus impact load. All right, so now we have our 4 pivot charts. Okay, so tune in for the final step. We'll kind of aggregate this information and put all of those charts on a single page, kind of on a single dashboard. Hello again, and welcome back to the last step in this informative video on how to create a dashboard using sample data from IMU. This is Kevin with Preventicx, and in this final step, I'm just going to show you how we can create a single spreadsheet tab that kind of has all of our data on one of these tabs. So in the last step, I showed you how we created 4 sample pivot tables and their resulting visual representation. So here we're going to just create a new blank tab. We're just going to rename this dashboard. If I get my spelling right. Dashboard. Okay, so here's our blank dashboard canvas, and we're just going to go back to our first pivot table. We're going to right click and copy our chart, come back to the data tab, paste that. We're going to orient this in a way we can do some kind of background, give a little background to it, maybe a border, thick outside border. Then we're going to go back to our next one and do the same thing. Copy, come back to our dashboard, paste. All of our charts have the chart titles on there. Again, we'll just kind of dress this up a little bit. This is a nice, easy way, like I mentioned, to just kind of represent your data on one chart. We'll go back to our total steps bar chart. There we go. I had lost it there for a second. Okay, so we're going to just dress this up a little bit. There we go. And then our last one, total steps versus impact load. Copy that, come back here, paste that. Okay, so now we have all of our graphical representation. So here's our one-stop shop, right? So again, this is all driven by our sample data. So if you think about what we did over these course of these 4 steps, we downloaded data from IMU, we brought it into Excel, and we created these pivot charts. If our data expands, okay, if we went and grabbed more data after the 28th, for example, this was our last day in the sample, we can see that here, right? Our chart stops at 28. If we had new data in our source table here, all we would have to do is come back to our pivot tables, right? Go to pivot table analyze and refresh the pivot table, right? That's all we have to do to see how our new data gets incorporated into these charts. So that's the nice thing about what we've done, is we've created a data flow where it's 1 or 2 clicks to get your data to refresh in your dashboard. So I hope you enjoyed this kind of a teaser informative video. Stay tuned for an upcoming live webinar on a little bit more detail to this, using some other data sources as well with iMeasureU. So thanks again for tuning in, and have a great day.